In all of my presentations, I do want to give credit to those sources from which I have drawn much of the information. And in this particular case, there are three books in particular that I very strongly recommend. Suzanne Madsen, The Power of Project Leadership. Suzanne is actually another presenter as part of this series. John Cotter, this is a classic book, A Force for Change, How Leadership Differs from Management. And then finally, David West's book called Project Sponsorship, an essential guide for those sponsoring projects within their organizations. And we'll talk more about project sponsorship later in the presentation. Now, one thing I want to make clear at the outset, there is far more content in my presentation than I am going to cover in detail in the next 45 minutes to an hour. And I do that for two reasons. One, I want to make sure you have this information readily at hand. And two, I want to give you a reason, an excuse to go back and read the presentation in more detail at your leisure, because there is a lot of content here. And so I will be happy to send each and every one of you a PDF copy of the presentation. My email ID will be displayed at the end of the presentation. It's simply john.bowen@cai.io, and we'll display it again at the end. So again, very, very happy to share the presentation with you and to answer any specific questions or to engage in dialogue with you. I would encourage you to let me know what you agree with, and even more so, those areas of the presentation where you might disagree with my opinions. So let's begin. The agenda we're going to talk about, first of all, the imperative for change, the fact that only projects can create that change, what actually is project success, projects and people, and then we'll get into the heart of the presentation. What is management? What is leadership? And specifically, what is project leadership? And then how do you become a project leader? And again, in all of my presentations, I include a bibliography, suggested reading, both books and internet sources. And we will leave time at the end of the presentation for any questions any of you might have. So first of all, this is an exciting time to be part of project management. First of all, every organization has to continually change if it is to survive. You've probably seen multiple headlines like this: adapt or die, your business's only option in an evolving economy. Businesses must embrace change to remain relevant. We can go on and on. There are many, many examples of the fact that every organization has to continually change if it is to survive. And interestingly enough, only 60 of the original 500 or 12% companies that were in the S&P 500 in 1955 remained on the list in 2017. Companies on the list in 1965 stayed an average of 33 years. By 1990, the life expectancy of a corporation was 20 years. By 2026, it's expected to be around 14 years. And it is predicted that 50% of today's S&P 500 will be replaced over the next 10 years. This is simply evidence of the fact that organizations have to change if they are going to survive. And for those of you who might be curious, this slide illustrates these 60 companies were originally on the Fortune 500 in both 1955 and 2017. I provided simply for your information. Now, given that organizations must change in order to survive, how do you do that? Well, it turns out that only projects can create change. And again, a wonderful time to be involved in project management. Some very powerful quotations here. Projects drive business innovation and change. In fact, the only way organizations can change, implement a strategy, innovate, or gain competitive advantage is through projects. Another very, very powerful quotation here from CIO magazine. Projects have become the essential part of any organization. By 2025, a mere 2 years from now, senior leaders and managers will spend at least 60% of their time selecting, prioritizing, and overseeing the execution of projects. We will talk much more later in this presentation about the role of the executive sponsor. But the key message here is that Even according to PMI, only 38% of projects finish on time within budget, and only 65% meet their original goal and business intent. So obviously we need to do something better. And the something better that I have discovered and have spent the last 5 or 6 years of my career promoting is what was originally referred to as PM 2.0. More recently, it has been referred to as advanced project management. And it consists of these elements. Most importantly, project leadership, smack dab in the center, which is why this presentation was put together. I also have presentations on the other 5 key elements of advanced project management, specifically project governance, collaboration, metrics and key performance indicators, continuous measurement, and continuous status monitoring via a dynamic dashboard. And again, here's a little bit more detail about what these 6 components of advanced project management entail. And we'll be talking a little bit more about some of these, in particular leadership in the lower right corner and project governance in the upper left corner. And again, if you have any questions about any of the rest of these, I'd be happy to engage in discussion or give a presentation on any of these or all of these to your organization. What's most important in this evolution of project management is, number 1, the definition of a project, and number 2, the definition of a project's success. Compare on this slide, definition of a project from PM 1.0, which describes it as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. What's missing from that definition is business value, which leads us to the PM 2.0 or advanced project management definition of a project, which is a collection of realized and sustainable business value. And the definition of project success evolves from completion of the project within the triple constraints of time, cost, and scope to achieving the desired business value within the bounds of competing constraints, however many there are. And in fact, the original definition, limited to time, cost, and scope, was always misleading because projects always had to deal with at least 10 different, what I refer to as dimensions, and what the PMI refers to as knowledge areas. And so to suggest that completing the project only within the triple constraints of time, cost, and scope was always overly simplistic. And in fact, especially in the case of global or international projects, the bounds of competing constraints become exceedingly numerous, and it becomes a very, very imposing challenge for the project manager to achieve success. Now, project success, there are only 3 reasons for undertaking a business project. Number 1, increase revenue. Number 2, decrease costs. Or number 3, reduce risk. And every business case must address one or more of these 3. And if it's not abundantly clear to each and every member of your project team which of these 3 reasons your project was justified, then you need to have a meeting with your project team. You need to review the project justification, the project business case, and the project charter, because it is absolutely important that everyone understand why we are undertaking this project on behalf of the organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about the role of the of project governance and the project sponsor in a little bit. Now, projects and people. Let me, I mentioned earlier that there have always been more than scope, schedule, and cost as being elements of project leadership or project management. PMI refers to these as knowledge areas. Now, what's interesting is that of these 10 areas, the 2 objective or quantifiable dimensions of project management, for which metrics and tools are commonplace, are almost never the cause of project failure. I've actually spent quite a bit of time doing personal research on some of the more infamous large project failures. And I include this in part of a class I teach at Lehigh University. And it's not difficult to prove that in approximately 85% of the cases, Projects don't fail because they are over schedule or over budget. Projects are over schedule or over budget because they are failing. And they fail because we are not adequately managing the subjective or human dimensions of project management. And let me tell you a story. When I first started at Pennsylvania Power and Light, PPL Corporation, after a certain number of years, PPL's approach was to send every young computer programmer, me, every young accountant, and every young engineer to a 2-day project management class. And in that class, we learned how to perform a work breakdown structure, how to create a project plan, how to resource the plan, how to estimate the cost of the plan. I was even proud of the fact that I learned how to identify the critical path of the project. And when we returned to the office, after having a 2-day class, which was essentially a Microsoft project class, we were expected to be able to manage projects. And we were given no understanding, no training in how to manage the human or subjective dimensions of the projects. And as it says here, and as multiple studies have confirmed, the vast majority of projects fail, not because of budget or schedule, but because we are failing to manage the human dimensions of the project. Now, these are the 10 that PMI typically refers to. I would prefer to combine time management and cost management and measure them both as earned value. And I would add organizational change management, which I think is very, very often overlooked. So let's go on here. What exactly is management? Management occurred or evolved or was developed in the early part of the 20th century as a way to manage, as it says here, the status quo. The discipline that specializes on conforming to standards and organizing and directing individuals around boundaries that have been set to achieve a task. And you can well imagine, as industrialization evolved, and unfortunately more and more people were put in a position where they were playing a role in an assembly line, in essence, regardless of whether that assembly line was in fact in a factory or in a business office. The point was that each and every one of us had a little piece of a much bigger process. And management was the discipline that evolved to ensure that each and every one of us was doing our job and only our job, and doing it as effectively and as cost efficiently as possible. Management, as it says here, brings order and consistency to process dimensions like quality and profitability, achieves efficiency, and is largely the product of the last 100 years. Now, unfortunately, and so management, as you can see on this chart, these are some of the elements of management. It's task-oriented, skills-based, processes, methods, authority, telling people what to do, and above all, maintaining the status quo. Now, what exactly is project management then? Project management is the application of knowledge, skills, tools, etc., to project activities so as to meet or exceed stakeholder needs and expectations. And typically, when we think of project management, we think of these things: adherence to a methodology or definition and development of a defined and rigorous project management methodology, adherence to processes, focus on project plans, status reporting, project meetings, developing time tracking, issues tracking, etc. What's interesting, however, is that that is not what is needed for projects to succeed. So let's go back and talk about what is leadership. Leadership, as contrasted with management, is concerned with setting goals, making improvements to existing ways of working, motivating, leading the team to reaching a new direction. It moves people from where they are to where they want to be, establishes direction, aligns people, mobilizes people and or their ideas, and unlike management, which is a product of the last 100 years, leadership has been around for millennia, is ageless. Typically, qualities ascribed to leadership, unlike the chart we saw earlier with management, are intelligence, energy, empathy, people skills, ambition, a drive to succeed, and perseverance. And so if we contrast the two, management and leadership, what we can see is that management is task-oriented, focused on maintaining existing processes, whereas leadership is focused on vision, inspiration. Instead of telling people what to do, it's asking people for their opinion. Instead of maintaining the status quo, it's involved in taking risks to try to change where we are, to get from where we are to where we want to be. Now, I've got a couple of slides here I'm not going to go over in detail. They contrast the difference between a manager and a leader. And I encourage you to go back and read these at your leisure, but it's just pulling out some of the key differences here. The leader establishes direction, looks at the big picture, aligns people, focuses on motivation and inspiration. The leader places emphasis on the people in the organization, tends to focus on longer-term problems as opposed to short-term. Will ask questions like what and why. Can best be described as his or her own person. And so there are some very interesting contrast and differences between what a manager does and what a leader does. So having gone through what is management, what is leadership, what exactly is project leadership? Look at this chart in detail. The skills in the column on the left are what we traditionally expect of our project managers. Adherence to methodology, adherence to process, development of project plans, rigorous and consistent status reporting, maintaining communication through project meetings, time tracking issues. Whereas I would argue, and have argued, that what we really need in our project managers is the skill set in the column on the right. Creating alignment, communication, tenacity, focus, motivation, inspiration, action, and energy. And so I argue, my premise is that the skills in the column on the left, what we traditionally refer to as project management, are, in my opinion, more accurately defined as project administration. And what we really mean when we say project management is the skill set in the column on the right. That is to say, project leadership. Now, unfortunately, as I described earlier in the experience from PPL Corporation, all too often we take young people, we train them in project administration skills, such as Microsoft Project or some other scheduling tool, and we then say, you are now qualified to be a project manager, without ever considering the essential need to ensure that these people have the skills to be effective leaders. Now, who is responsible for project leadership? Your first answer might tend to be, well, it's the project manager. Well, in fact, there are three roles that, in my experience, must demonstrate leadership. And I'll talk about each of these a little bit. The first is project governance. Now, there are two aspects to project governance. There is the demand side, which says, are we doing the right projects? And then there is the supply side, which says, are we doing those projects right? Now, whatever group is responsible for project governance within your organization, and it could be many different variations, such as a project management office, it could be an executive steering committee, it could be a periodic business planning activity, or in some cases, it's actually internal auditing. But whatever organization, whatever group is responsible for project governance, that group must demonstrate leadership. Because there is absolutely nothing worse than doing well that which should not be done at all. And let me tell you a story. I teach a class at Lehigh on effective project executive sponsorship. And in one of my classes, one of the executives attending was a CFO of a very large chocolate company based in Pennsylvania. And he told me that every 3 months, they have an executive steering committee that reviews the ongoing business case for every project that is currently underway, that is in flight, as well as every project that is queued up waiting to be resourced. And they reevaluate the assumptions that were valid at the time that each of the projects in flight was justified. And they reevaluate whether that business case or those business cases are still the best use of their resources. And every 3 months, they invariably cancel one or more projects because either the customer demand has changed or the economics of the situation have changed. And what's fascinating to me is that when they cancel a project, they celebrate that fact. They actually hold a celebration because they then recognize and want to communicate to their staff that they are now redeploying critically short resources to other projects that are now demonstrably going to provide better business value to the organization. And so I think that's an excellent example of where a governance body is demonstrating leadership. Now, as it says here, project governance provides the structure through which the objectives of the project are set, the means of attaining those objectives, and monitoring performance. And so if you don't have a project governance body in place, you absolutely need to establish one. Now, who is responsible for project governance? As it says here on the bottom, let there be no misunderstanding. The project sponsor is responsible for ensuring that project governance occurs. And what exactly does that mean? Project governance defines which project metrics to measure, how to measure them. Project sponsor, in turn, is responsible for selecting the metrics appropriate for each and every project, for providing the resources necessary to complete the project successfully. Then project management, as it says here, is responsible for continuous measurement of those key metrics, and the project team provides the continuous data that feeds into each and every one of these metrics. So if the project sponsor is ultimately responsible for project governance, then what exactly does that mean? Multiple studies, and this is one that we at Computer Aid have, or CAI, have developed into an effective leadership management tool, is based on work that was headed up by Dr. Leon Kappelman at the University of North Texas. He and a number of his colleagues evaluated the root cause of hundreds of failed projects. And what was fascinating to me when I first became aware of this research was that the number one reason that projects fail to meet the business objectives for which they were justified is lack of top management support or commitment to the project. And it struck me as absolutely eye-opening, because over my career, when I eventually rose to the point where I was an executive and I was responsible for projects as an executive sponsor, no one took me aside and said, "John, here's a class that we would like you to attend because it will tell you what it means to be a project sponsor." And so I did some research and discovered that very, very few companies provide any kind of training to their executives in what it means to be a project sponsor. And no university provides training in that regard either. And so some colleagues and I developed a 3-day class on executive project sponsorship that we teach as part of the executive training program at Lehigh University. And it's been very eye-opening, because it's not that executives are mean people or stupid people. It's simply that they don't understand and have never been taught what their role entails. And so if you want a little more information about Dr. Kappelman's research, he then defines the the critical risks of project success into people-related risks and process-related risks, and then reshuffles them into what he refers to as the 4 horsemen of IT project doom. And again, if you would like a copy of the PDF that he published summarizing his results, again, just send me an email at the end of the presentation. I'll be happy to send it to you. So specifically, the role of the project sponsor. It's an active senior management role responsible for identifying the business need, problem, or opportunity, and ensuring that the project remains a viable proposition and that the benefits for which the project was justified are in fact realized. And so it's a very, very critical role. And in many ways, it's a role of interpreting or translation, because in a typical project structure, you have the project manager speaking and listening downward to the project team, as well as external contractors, suppliers, etc. The sponsor's task is to communicate the status of the project to his or her peers at the executive level. And so there's a responsibility to translate project speak, and every project I've ever been involved with eventually develops its own vernacular, its own language, its own set of acronyms. And the sponsor has to take that gobbledygook and turn it back into business terminology so that his or her peers are continually reminded, why did we approve this project? And what will be the benefit to the organization when it is successful? That's one of the key roles of the project sponsor. In addition, as I said earlier, identifying the business need, owning the business case, selecting or hiring the project manager, translating and communicating, and then ensuring any resources that are needed are made available when and as needed by the project. And here's a simple chart that kind of explains the difference between the project sponsor and the project manager, who is responsible for what. Again, encourage you to use this at your however you want. And as I said earlier, projects have become the essential part of any organization. And this quotation, this prediction by CIO magazine, by 2025, senior leaders and managers will spend at least 60% of their time selecting, prioritizing, and overseeing the execution of projects. This is a massive disruption. This is clearly going to change the role of leadership at the executive level in virtually every organization. And I would argue that without training for your executives in what it means to be an effective project sponsor, this is not going to be successful. Let me give you another story. A couple of years ago, probably about 10 years ago, a colleague and I were invited to New York City to meet with the chief technology officer of one of the big 3 networks. It doesn't matter which one. And it was a he in this case, was also responsible for project management throughout the organization. And he confessed his frustration to us by saying that his project managers, all of whom were PMI certified, he couldn't trust them to manage the project teams or the projects themselves. He said, all I can really count on them to manage is the project plan. And unfortunately, what then happened is that managing the project teams and the projects themselves fell to the project sponsors from the business units, who correctly said, that's not my responsibility, that's not my job. And so then, unfortunately, managing the project team and the project itself kind of fell to the IT folks who were members of each of these projects. And so his frustration was, what do I do? And we told him in no uncertain terms that he had 2 alternatives. Number one, he could take his existing project managers, who were really more correctly labeled project administrators, and try to make them leaders. Or he could acknowledge that some of them did not have leadership skills or leadership potential, and he could reassign them as project administrators, working alongside a new group of project leaders that he would hire from the outside with proven leadership skills. Now, this always raises the question, can you teach leadership, or can you make leaders of people if it's not part of their inherent DNA? And when I give this presentation live, there's always a lively debate. Some people say, no, you can't teach leadership. It's either part of your core or it's not. And then someone from the audience will always stand up and say, no, that's not true. The military builds leaders every day. And then someone else from the audience will say, well, I was in the military, and they don't make leaders. They filter for leadership potential. When it is seen or found, they then hone it. And so it continues to be a debate. But if you want to enter the debate, I'd be happy to engage with you. But going back to the situation of the chief technology officer, who was at fault at the fact that the project sponsors were being asked to lead the project team? Well, in fact, it was the project sponsors themselves, because as I showed earlier, the responsibility for ensuring there is project governance ultimately falls to the project sponsor. Now, ideally, the organization would have had a PMO at first, would have had some sort of a governance process, but absent that, it's really the sponsor's responsibility to say, this is not working. These project managers are not doing what they need to do. We need to hire those who can. So again, the project sponsor is the one who bears the responsibility. Now, project leadership. If we eliminate the term project management, going back to the slide that we showed earlier, project management, the skills in the column on the left, more accurately, I would argue, are project administration. What we really want to mean by project management is what I refer to as project leadership, the skills in the column on the right. And project leadership, typically project managers manage tasks, events, and processes at the expense of leading people, unfortunately. Project managers tend, unfortunately, to be somewhat reactive and focus on the urgent rather than the important, and very often believe that they have to be the smartest person in the room, as opposed to acknowledging that the real talent lies in the project team. So is this just semantics? Am I really just talking about the same thing using different terminology? And if we go back to the PMBOK, the infamous PMBOK version 5, it was about an 800-page book, for those of you who recall. And it included only 3 paragraphs on project leadership. Jump ahead a couple of years, PMBOK version 6, which was released in September of 2017, now included an entire chapter on the role of the project manager, focusing on technical skills, business understanding, and more importantly, leadership. According to PMI research, over 80% of high-performing organizations now report that the most important acquired skill for project managers to successfully manage complex projects are leadership skills. So I don't think this is simply semantics. I think we are truly acknowledging that project leadership is the critical component that has been missing over the years, and that has led to, go back to the statistics from PMI, the fact that almost 40% of projects fail to deliver the business value for which they were justified. And the PMI talent triangle now gives leadership the same level of importance as technical project management, again, which I refer to as project administration, and strategic and business management. So I think we have come full circle and finally acknowledge that project leadership is critical. Now, if you understand or believe that you can become a project leader, then I've got some examples in here, or some recommendations on how to go about doing that. So keys to project leadership: be authentic, lead with vision, improve and innovate, empower the team, make sure that you are absolutely joined at the hip with your stakeholders, establish a solid foundation of project administration, and work with intent. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but in the presentation, again, I encourage you to read, there's a lot more detail on what each of these things means. Just as an example, being authentic. Admit you don't know the complete picture. I like the first one here. There must be congruence among what you think, feel, say, and do. Come to a conclusion or decision, know your core values and live by them. So some very, very powerful recommendations on what it means to be a leader. To lead with vision, the project leader must align the project output, the deliverables of the project, with its results, the business value that is delivered, and how that ties to a corporate vision or strategy. As opposed to simply saying, I'm going to deliver what the business case says, and if it doesn't really contribute to improving the position or condition or strength of the organization, then that's not my problem. That's not the attitude that we expect of our project leaders. I like this chart because it says leadership is the combination of knowledge and vision. So exactly where do we get the knowledge that the project leader has to have? Well, as it says, knowledge is the combination of information and insight. Information, in turn, is a combination of objective data and subjective awareness. All too often over the years, we have tended to focus on conventional project management tools such as MS Project, some sort of business intelligence or data mining tool, which gives us data. It doesn't provide awareness. Therefore, it doesn't provide information. Traditional feedback processes, such as management by walking around, gives us opinions, perceptions, concerns, which is awareness and insight, but it doesn't link those to data. And what you really need then is a combination of a system-derived data source, a traditional project management tool, as well as an automated way to get human input, feedback from everyone that is involved in the project. And that could be the project team members, the stakeholders, customers, suppliers, subcontractors, etc. Link those two sources of information, data and awareness, together, and what you will essentially create then is awareness and knowledge, which is essentially what we're striving for here. Becomes leadership. Improve and innovate. These are some of additional skills of a leader. Again, I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail. Empowering the team. Getting close to your stakeholders, establishing a solid foundation. This is where project administration is still important. It's absolutely essential, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And then working with intent. I think this is a very powerful slide. All too often, we spend a lot of our time in fighting fires or time-wasting activities. Firefighting is necessary. These things are going to occur, crises, deadlines, etc. And unfortunately, there are some unimportant calls, interruptions, all of which are categorized as wasting time. What we really want to be doing is spending our time in the proactive triangle, portion of this triangle, doing things like planning, risk mitigation, project definition, building relationships. That's where the project manager, the project leader, should be spending his or her time. So in summary, project leadership. The premise here is that organizations must evolve to survive. The only way to effectively create change is through projects. Conclusion is that project success is increasingly critical to organizational survival. The premise here is that management is focused on repetitive process efficiency. Projects are not repetitive processes. By their very definition, projects are transformational, disruptive, one-time events, which is what leadership is focused on. Conclusion, projects require leadership for success. And I'll throw the caveat in, project also requires supporting processes, which I refer to as project administration. Challenge to each and every one of you. Every project manager should work toward becoming a project leader, and every organization must have a project governance process that promotes and requires project leadership. A great quotation is that successful projects are led, not managed. And my own quotation, you cannot manage a project to success, you must lead a project to success. With that, I will leave you with some a bibliography of recommended sources and both books as well as online sources. And at that, I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments. My offer is sincere. I'll be happy to send the presentation as well as the research from Dr. Leon Kappelman for anyone who's interested. And if you're interested in learning about some of the other presentations in my portfolio, I can send that to you as well.
Our first question, John, is for individual talent development plans or goals, what trainings do you recommend seniors PM take of sources or things like that, et cetera?
Well, I didn't go into a lot of detail in the presentation here at the end where it talks about becoming a project leader. There are a number of slides there which talk about the specific things about authenticity, vision, innovation, empowerment, et cetera. And a lot of that comes from the book by Susan Madsen, The Power of Project Leadership. I would definitely start there. And I will do a little bit of research and suggest that, and I can send out as well some recommended classes. But my first recommendation would be to start with Susan's book.
Great, thank you, John. Our next question, for software development, can you please shed some light on Agile Scrum help in project leadership?
That's an interesting question. I've been told over the years that with Agile, the role of the project manager goes away, and project management and project leadership are not part of Agile. Simply because there is no project manager defined or role defined in the Agile team, to which I say nonsense. You still need someone to act as the leader. You still need someone to act as the manager of the group or the administrator. And so even though the role definitions are somewhat different and the role titles are somewhat different, I don't think that changes the need for project leadership, for project executive sponsorship. It just transfers that responsibility to a different set of people. And again, I have done some research on that, and there are some good articles out there that talk about the role of project leadership in an Agile environment. And so if whoever asked the question wants to send me an email, I'll be happy to share some of that with you as well. But the bottom line is that all of the requisites for project success, being sponsorship and governance and leadership, are there in spades in an Agile environment, just as they are in a traditional IT waterfall development environment.
John, we thank you so much for presenting with us today.
Thank you again, Susan. I'll be happy to join you again.